So I was just talking about biases and the omission, commission bias, and then the status quo bias. So the idea here is the following. What do people regret when you look at deciding to not perform an action, meaning omission, deciding to perform an action, meaning commission, and how does that link to regret? Well, what's interesting about this is that people tend to regret actions that they have taken more than the actions that they have not taken. And this is specifically when you look at younger samples of college students. So original work on this was mostly done with younger people. And there they very consistently found that people have a bias towards regretting actions that they have taken, meaning commission, and actually feel less regret over things that they have not done. What's interesting is that people now have, or researchers have also since done studies with people later in life, so older adults and even elderly. And what's interesting there is that this actually tends to switch. So as people age, they actually start regretting the things they haven't done more than the things that they have done. And how might this affect decisions? Well, if people are starting to be older and they don't want to regret not having done something, they may become more inclined to just try to do stuff and see what happens. Okay? And I personally once had a direct experience with this. So it's a side note story, but it was pretty funny and it demonstrates this actual concept. So what happened was the following. It was a summer day and I was in my front yard cutting my lawn with a lawnmower. And as I'm cutting the lawn, this lady pulls up, an older woman, maybe in her 80s, and pulls up and rolls down her window. And she yells at me and yells, "Nice ass." So I stopped and, first of all, identified who was talking to me, stopped the lawnmower, and I said, "Excuse me, woman, you like my grass?" Because I thought she said nice grass. And then she said, "No, you have a nice ass." And then rolled up her window and drove away and just left me perplexed. And then I thought, being the nerd I am, and I had just talked about decision making in lectures that week, wow, this is a really interesting example of this switch in regretting actions that you haven't taken. This woman clearly does not care anymore, just shells it right out for whatever reason, and that was the end of that. So if you see older people, just be aware you don't know what's coming at you. They're willing to engage in just about anything. Okay? All right. So last thing, situation where you see an omission bias as well, is when you look at vaccinations. And you may notice, especially if you're a parent, the vaccination debate is ever ongoing and does not ever seem to be going away. And part of the reason for that is, of course, that there has been this claim in the 60s and 70s by a complete, what I call ding-dong douchebag, by the name of Andrew Wakefield, a British physician who claimed that he had established a link between getting vaccinated and the rate of autism. So his claim was that people who were vaccinated displayed a higher rate of autism. Now, if that were true, you could imagine that parents would think, well, I'd rather not really get my child vaccinated because I certainly don't want to stick a needle in my child and then later on find out that actually led to them developing autism. Now, turns out that the link is absolutely not substantiated. Since that original study, there have been oodles of studies that have demonstrated that this link is not in fact real. There is no link between vaccinating and autism. And it actually turned out that Dr. Wakefield, or doctor at the time, he has been stripped from all of his medical credentials, had actually fudged the data, and even the data from his original study were not trustworthy. But nonetheless, this is still sticking around. And why does this story stick around so much? Well, again, part of the reason is the notion of an omission bias. People would rather not have interfered and stayed the course, right, the status quo bias, than knowing that they took a certain action that then actually led to some sort of negative consequence. So you see this in vaccinations. So imagine that there's a vaccine available that avoids a fatal, deadly disease that occurs in 10 out of 10,000 children. Okay? And let's now say that the vaccination has a deadly side effect in 7 out of 10,000 children. If that's true, would you have your child vaccinated? So, rationally speaking, the answer would be yes, because the chance of them dying from side effects of the vaccine are smaller than the chances of them dying if they don't get the vaccine. Right? So, rationally speaking, people should go for this. However, at this ratio, 7 versus 10, people don't. People decide to rather not vaccinate because the notion of sticking a needle in your child that then led to them dying, you can imagine that there's absolute grief and regret involved in that. So people would rather not and just stay the course and not vaccinate. Now, of course, you can play around in experiments with very systematically varying what the rate of death is and what the rate of death would have been without the vaccination. And it turns out that when it starts to switch from instead of 7 to about 5 out of 10,000 versus 10 out of 10,000, so about double the amount, this is when people are starting to decide that vaccinating is actually worth it. And it's interesting that that ratio of 5 versus 10, meaning double, right, is again related to loss aversion. Double the amount of loss is what we saw already when we look at the way in which people weigh losses versus gains. And it turns out that if the ratio exceeds that doubling, this is when people would rather take action and take the risk. So the level of anticipated regret when one's child dies is higher for the case in which one's own decision had caused the death. And again, you need a doubling of the benefits basically for that loss aversion to be outweighed by the potential increase in gains.